Reacting to our favorite or least favorite picks of the 2025 NFL draft and what it means for fantasy football. That is what we are talking about today on RotoViz Overtime. It's myself, Colm Kelly. I'm joined as always by Shawn Siegele. Shawn, the NFL draft is in the books. You and Ben had a pretty marathon run of draft coverage on day 2, day 3 over on the Stealing Signals YouTube channel. Those shows are being published up on the Stealing Bananas podcast feed over the course of the weekend. People may have had a chance to hear some of those. We're going to dive in today to some of our favorite areas of the draft and what it means going forward. But I have to ask you, NFL draft, we've been talking about it for weeks and weeks. We do know the landing spots. Did it live up to the hype here? Are you excited to see how these players do now in the NFL?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things we've talked a lot about is this idea that the draft was deep at some positions, not necessarily at others, but that those third and fourth round picks in your rookie draft were going to matter. And yet, when the draft actually happens, we have some guys who slide, and that tends to weaken things a little bit. Colm, there just wasn't that much of that. When I went through and put together my post-draft top 60, so I was updating it more or less live as the draft was going on. Did that for day 1, obviously day 2, day 3 with all the streaming. Those were delayed, but they did go up already late Saturday night and have now been up for a little more than a day. There were more players in green, the risers, than there were players in red. And part of that is that even some of the guys who actually fell a little bit in the rankings were risers from the perspective of they landed in good spots and they were going to be more valuable post-draft relative to veterans than I had projected. So we're always pretty aggressive in how we rank those rookies to make sure people are drafting enough of them in pre-draft best ball. Things like the FFPC Never Too Early tournaments column. I was looking back at the draft that I did. I got into one of the very final FFPC Never Too Early Superflex drafts, and my team ended up being quite a bit of fun in the back half of the draft there, where I was going almost exclusively running back. Got Cameron Scattaboo, RJ Harvey. DJ Giddens was one of the fallers. That part was unfortunate. But then Brashard Smith, Trevor Etienne, Jarquez Hunter. Pretty excited about that group as you think of moving forward with this individual team, but certainly with those guys, and a draft there that included Brock Bowers, a bunch of receivers, and then Bo Nix, Justin Fields, and CJ Stroud all early. I mean, I've got some hope that could be the team that wins the Never Too Early tournament. So thinking through how those players are moving around. Now, I mentioned Giddens. That one was frustrating. I think that Damian Martinez was someone who weirdly fell. A lot of far inferior backs went ahead of him, and then he goes to the Seahawks. So not only does he fall, but he's behind two really good players. Certainly a really good player in Kenneth Walker, and then a solid potential leader of the backfield in Zach Charbonnet. So it's not that guys weren't hurt. We do have a small handful of players who really do lose steam, but generally, both in terms of how early they went relative to expectation and then where they went, I thought this draft was very favorable for the rookies. That's pretty exciting.
Yeah, especially when I kind of I don't know if I've been hinting at on this, but I feel like sometimes we get up to the NFL draft and we're excited for where players are going to land, and then they land on top of players that you already like, or they go to a situation where you don't think they are going to fit. This felt like, as we went through that first round, that a lot of it felt pretty good with like how it was going, and we will get to it in a minute. Shawn, feeling all pretty good until we got to the Packers, who do take a wide receiver who we'll talk about in a moment, but maybe not the one that we were hoping that would land there. But like you mentioned, Giddens, that was one where you kind of be like, well, he's behind Jonathan Taylor. The one on the Seahawks is interesting with Martinez. I did record just shortly before recording this with Shawn, with Connor Allen from 4 for 4. He was talking through some of the Bears scenarios, with DeAndre Swift, and he's talked about some reporting that the Bears may be interested in the backup there in Seattle, being able to potentially get Charbonnet onto the Bears over the coming weeks. It feels like the Bears are looking to acquire a running back via trade. That would obviously be fantastic for Kenneth Walker, but would help Martinez there in that situation. But I think overall, when we let the dust settle and how things have played out, I think this is a really kind of positive draft, rather than one of those where you're coming out being like, oh, it's pretty crushing. And I think an easy way, Shawn, for you to see that is when you're updating the rankings and the players are moving up rather than moving down, which is awesome at this time of the year. A couple of players who obviously moved up. You've McMillan goes 8 to the Carolina Panthers. I think that's exciting. We'll see how that fits and how everything works out in Carolina with Bryce Young. Henderson to the Patriots may be a dagger to the other son in the Patriots, that is Ramondre Stevenson. But Shawn, I want to ask you on the Travis Hunter scenario. We've had over the last 3 weeks the movement as he moves kind of from the conversation. I think it might only have been like last week when we were like, it looks like whoever takes him is going to go as a wide receiver first of all. The Jaguars trade up, they take him at 2 overall. I had a rookie draft that kicked off over the weekend. I got him at 108. I could not pass up the, I want to have some of this guy feeling. How did you feel about the Hunter to the Jaguars move, him now paired there with Brian Thomas?
It's exciting. It'll be interesting to see where he ends up in the rankings. Colm, we have the volume 3 of the RotoViz rookie guide for folks now post-draft. And that includes new rankings, new tiers, 1 QB, 2 QB, or I should say Superflex. And I also wrote up an explanation of the tiers and then how even within some of the tiers you should attack, whether that's trading down, making sure you get your guys, how you're looking at the different positions, all of that type of thing. And that first tier where you really have this, kind of the big 6 is very interesting because there are a lot of strong opinions, different analysts, different fantasy managers of who they want from that group. Now, we do tend to see GT obviously hovering there at the top, usually at the 101, but the rest of that group is probably relatively close to him. We've said all along that we thought that Hunter was going to play offense. And that is how the Jaguars intend to approach this. In some ways, it seems like a bit of an overreaction, some of the sentiment related to Hunter, in that, for me, this was always baked in, that he was always going to play offense, but he was always also going to play defense. And so now that the enthusiasm kind of switches to this element where, it's all guns blazing on the offensive side and into probably a better situation because Trevor Lawrence gives you a lot of things that some
versus Cleveland, you mean?
Right.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Colm, the QB situation there remains somewhat humorous.
Just the 4-way camp battle they have to deal with. Yeah.
Right.
And
those
that's
usually
not to
go
talk
pretty
about
well.
the 5th quarterback who is out with a torn Achilles.
Yeah. But if you can run 3 layers of practice, then you can probably get all those QBs out there, like legitimately competing. At the same time, you do have Brian Thomas there. At the same time, Trevor Lawrence has had a lot of lives because he keeps getting new coordinators and he keeps getting new fun pieces.
I thought you were going to say because the Jaguars are like it's a cat. You could have went with that. No.
I do like that, Colm. He's certainly not what he was when he was drafted, and he's really even not what he was going into last year. He's now had a couple of seasons that are really Daniel Jones-like, in that he was awful as a rookie and he was awful again in 2024. We've sort of reached this Baker Mayfield resurrection arc.
You're pairing all these
Lawrence,
quarterback names. The Mayfield, the Lawrence category. I'm going to throw out a name, but does he fit into the the Andy Dalton vortex at this point?
Well, I think Andy Dalton was always better than kind of what we're looking at with Trevor Lawrence, which for a lot of people is going to be weird to say. At the same time, better with a lower ceiling, right?
Yeah.
You don't have nearly the arm talent there with Andy Dalton. You always had that element, which, again, for these guys who were drafted by Cleveland, and arm talent is the question for them, right? I mean, Dylan Gabriel can really, really play, but you have the size and the arm talent. And then Sanders, it was always this issue of, was he going to be drafted on his name or was he going to be drafted on his arm talent? Once he was drafted on his arm talent, you're like, okay, well, now everyone apparently sees this issue, which is that he doesn't have NFL arm strength. That, I think, is problematic in Cleveland in the same way that it was a problem for Andy Dalton playing in Cincinnati. You get some of these, and you can get them throughout the season, but certainly late in the season, some rain, some wind, while it's also cold. Can you play through those elements? We don't have those concerns for Trevor Lawrence, right? The concerns are, can you stay healthy? Can you throw accurately? Are you a lot more than, say, a Joe Flacco? And, Flacco's response to that would be, well, I led the Ravens to a Super Bowl title, and I got a massive payday after that. I had the exclusive franchise tag on me. If you can be Joe Flacco, that's good. There's some truth to that, but I mean, he got super hot during a playoffs that, won a Super Bowl for the Ravens and really changed the course of his career. But I mean, he's still someone with a big arm who had a lot of weaknesses. I mean, that's more or less what Trevor Lawrence has been to this point. Now, we talk about that Baker Mayfield resurrection. I mean, you're talking about someone in Lawrence who probably is sort of less of an overall talent than Mayfield. One of the things that we've always gotten from Mayfield is this elite competitiveness. And because he played hurt so much, there was a sense of a lack of arm talent there, where a lot of it may simply have just been injuries. I mean, Baker Mayfield, #1 overall pick. And, surrounded by a better team in college, but famously outdueling Patrick Mahomes in some of those epic Oklahoma, Texas Tech games. Having said all of that too, again, the thing with Lawrence is that healthy and firing on all cylinders, you also have more. I mean, even if you want to give Mayfield a pass on some of the injury stuff and praise him to the utmost level you can, there's still the element that Lawrence has more arm talent than he does. So if you get everything working properly and in sync, this is a perfect coordinator for you. You have Brian Thomas, and then Travis Hunter comes in and isn't just a unicorn from the perspective of playing both, but is actually a superstar receiver. And that's the question, Colm, because everything is focused so much on the ability to do both and do both well. But there's a difference between doing both well and suddenly being one of the best receivers in football. Almost entirely a separate question, or it's another layer or level to that question. You can be good and be a solid NFL starter without being what I think a lot of people are now going to hope Travis Hunter is. So you've got moving parts. You've got questions as it relates to Lawrence. You've got questions as it relates to Hunter. It's exciting, though. I mean, this is going to be sort of the story in the NFL in 2025.
Yeah, very, very exciting. And, if it all comes together and you get Brian Thomas starting to ascend to even above the level he was at, and then you also have a secondary piece here, extremely exciting, because it would also be taking Trevor Lawrence along with it. So you'd be getting multiple fantasy assets out of Jacksonville. As we started this show off, Shawn, we were like, what direction will we take the 2 episodes this week. I've made the decision that this is going to be the wide receiver edition. The second show will be the running back edition. So stay tuned later in the week for the running backs, because I think probably my favorite landing spot of the entire draft is a running back. We'll talk about that on that show. But another spot, Shawn, I really did like was the Jayden Higgins landing spot with the Houston Texans at number 34. The way this draft went, his running mate from college also drafted by the Texans, but the Texans now with Nico Collins, obviously Tank Dale going to miss the entire season, but they've set it up a little bit here to give more weapons to have around CJ Stroud. Again, we've talked through there with Trevor Lawrence, the issues that he's had. We had a sophomore slump from CJ Stroud. Now pairing him up with Higgins, they have 2 pretty big dudes on the outside here for the Texans. I thought this was a really nice spot. Ideally, it probably would have been better if Jalen Noel wasn't also drafted in on top of him, but I think that the team kind of have set a clear note here that which one they value higher in terms of draft capital. But what did you make of the Higgins landing spot here with Stroud, and how much of an impact can he have as a rookie?
Well, Higgins was one of the guys that we kept moving up and up and up in our rankings pre-draft. Love the combination of traits there, because you're almost getting a bit of an arbitrage play on McMillan.
Yeah.
Now, the McMillan landing spot was absolutely perfect. I think that it moves him up even from the very aggressive rankings that we had on him, both in Dynasty and in redraft oriented or seasonal oriented contests. And this is absolutely perfect. Now, could you have gone somewhere where the QB needed a weapon and didn't already have Nico Collins? Could you have gone to the situation like McMillan did? Maybe. But it's such a perfect pick for him in that he goes to Stroud. He goes about as early as he realistically could have. I think there was a possibility that he would sneak into the back end of the first round, especially when it's such a weak draft. But this is similar to what the Bills and the Chargers tried to do at the end of, or at that point in the draft last year. We saw it work out in a massive way with Ladd McConkey. We saw it fail miserably with Coleman. And the first thing, as I was kind of putting together the new rankings and trying to place Higgins' draft spot there in context, was the T. Higgins selection at a very similar spot in his draft. Now, for Higgins, he actually goes first, and then Chase is dropped in on him later. He has a chance to establish himself without the best receiver in football already being on his team. But I think that you're going to get that 1-2 punch with Collins and Higgins, especially here with what we got from CJ Stroud as a rookie. I think when you look at his collegiate profile and then what he was immediately, got more confidence in Stroud being able to be an actual or absolute superstar than I do for Trevor Lawrence. I expect both of those guys to bounce back, both of them to be more than what they were in 2024. But Stroud still has the really high level. He throws with more touch, more anticipation, just a lot more feel than Lawrence does. What we got from him as a rookie was so special. And then the concerted effort that the Texans made to build around him, as opposed to saying, well, it didn't make any sense, but you would still have the fear that the Packers and the Texans, who watched their passing offenses collapse last season and got really strong fantasy performances then from the 2 running backs, that they would say, well, let's just lean on our defenses. We still were close. We could have carved a path through the playoffs even without the passing game. Let's rely on that. It works now better than it probably has worked since, the 1990s. Neither team did that. Unfortunately for your Packers, they probably didn't select as quality of players, but it was great to see both teams coming out with a statement of, yeah, we understand that we need to be much more dynamic. We're going to score points. We're going to pass the ball.
Shawn has brought it up, so let's move to it. Shawn, the Packers are on the clock, and I'm like, you know what would be nice here? Let's pick Jayden Higgins. But they didn't do that. They let him go to the second pick of the second round to the Houston Texans. They drafted Matthew Golden at number 23. I was kind of, I was hoping that it was going to be Higgins at that particular point. Luther Burden was still available as well as a potential additional option. This is one where he actually, like we talked about the positivity of the draft based on, where he goes in terms of capital and everything. He actually moved up in your rankings in terms of the mock draft that you have up on rotoviz.com. It's one of those situations where, like, as a team fan, you're like, they haven't drafted a wide receiver in so long. I want a wide receiver. I've talked about the drops on the show. They need somebody like Golden. One of the things he hasn't really had an issue with is dropping the ball. So that is a positive. But it feels like some of the stuff we've talked about on the show may have also filtered through, I'm saying this tongue in cheek, to those teams based on, you need to have wide receivers that are going to catch the ball. You need to move away from the run game. You need to give your quarterback more pieces to have those opportunities and to convert first downs and so on. So while it's exciting the Packers take a wide receiver, it wasn't the wide receiver I wanted. Now, when we look at it as a non-team fan, I think that there's questions as to why you make that move. But the other thing is when you get down to 23, I think it became more palatable. It was a case of if it was, the Cowboys at 11, for example, I thought it was going to be too early. Maybe still at 23 it is. But they have added a very fast piece to this offense. The concern I have, and this is going to be something, Shawn, that we won't know until the season starts. The Packers last year, because they were so run heavy, for example, Jayden Reed doesn't be in on a lot of run play. So one of our favorite fantasy pieces from the Packers offense was not involved. Matthew Golden, I would not expect to be in there very much in those situations as well. So I'm hoping that this is a point that the Packers are going to try and do more in the passing game, which we thought they should have done all last offseason, which then would help these guys be fantasy relevant. You also aren't going to have Christian Watson involved for quite some time this season. I think it is going to really hurt Dontavian Wicks. I feel like last season may have been the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of, his opportunities here for the Packers offense. It feels like it's gone a bit too far in that direction. So I am hopeful this is going to open up the field again. I know this was something that you had messaged me that hopefully this is something that's good for Jayden Reed. But I think both these guys can have success in this offense. But I would have preferred a different wide receiver for my Green Bay Packers. So prior to the draft, this is a better outcome for Golden and, for fantasy this season. I don't think it's a bad landing spot for him at all. But I also have the concerns that we had heading into the draft still baked in. But how are you feeling now that the dust has settled and how things have played out here, other than feeling sorry for me that the Packers drafted Matthew Golden?
Yeah, the selection seems like an objectively bad pick. It also seems like an unfortunate pick tactically, because you think about the speed, and certainly there's extreme speed and athleticism there. But this was a very athletic class, and you have guys like Arian Smith, Ty Felton, Tamari Dike, Jalen Lane, Keandre Lambert-Smith. Lambert-Smith, somebody I think is really interesting if you want to get exposure to that Chargers offense inexpensively, right? Trey Harris, I think a good pick, a fun pick. He's going to be the guy who grabs most of the attention. Lambert-Smith, an interesting player with an interesting profile, extremely athletic. The Packers had the opportunity to add players who were speed players in an area of the draft that doesn't cost you your first round pick. Now, from their perspective, if you want to add that athleticism and you have a really high grade on this player, then you go ahead and make the pick.
And that's what it's going to come down to. The Packers, not on offense, but historically, as an organization for the last 5-6 years, they have gone for players with say an uber trait, like something that is they may not have the production, but they have something. They're drafting these players as if they're going to hit their ceiling. The problem is they don't often hit their ceiling, but I guess they're looking at it as if some of them hit it. It's probably better than having a bunch of, just another guy on your roster. But although it's on offense, it fits all the characteristics of the Packers being this guy's the fastest guy in the class. That's like the other guys might only be 100 of a second slower, but this guy's the fastest.
Well, and this kind of thing is easy to say in retrospect because you already know the answer, but they drafted Luke Musgrave because of the elite athleticism, yep. But they also did double dip there with Tucker Kraft. And a lot of us were looking at that and saying, I mean, you don't know for sure. Certainly they've given a signal of who they like better by the order that they picked him in. There's also, though, that element where if the team does address the position, but then makes a second pick, it's almost like, okay, well, they also had that guy so far above where he currently is that they
Shawn,
felt like
who
they
was
had
the second guy?
Yeah. So
who was the second guy, Shawn?
Well, Tucker Kraft.
Oh no, I'm on about this draft. Savion Williams. Are you telling me that he's better than Matthew Golden?
Well, Colin, so what I was more thinking was that we do want to consider Jalen Knoll.
Okay.
But also what I was thinking is that we want to keep Dylan Sampson in mind. I was very excited about Quinshon Judkins until the Sampson pick came in behind him. No, Savion Williams doesn't even seem like a receiver.
Yeah.
You've drafted kind of your
Ultra-turner.
Marshawn Lloyd replacement, which could be
I think
good.
this draft was very good for Marshawn Lloyd if you want to take a positive from the Green Bay Packers running back room.
But getting back to sort of your original question, I do think that it works from a team perspective in that the Packers were the second most efficient passing offense in football in 2023. They were getting guys wide open. We like Jordan Love. We like, at times, Matt LaFleur when he's not going into a shell and just calling those Josh Jacobs carries. I think the question that I would throw back to you is, how can they run this offense so that both guys are on the field? You've got the two focal points of your passing offense in Golden and Reed are not big players.
Yeah.
And if you are going to simultaneously take the approach that, well, you've got to have blocking receivers on the field for a lot of these running plays, and you've got to be macho enough, you've got to be run-oriented enough to keep that element in play, then I think not only was this a bad pick objectively, but now it's created tactical problems for you as well. One of the big questions going into last season was, is there some weirdness here with Jayden Reed being the clear-cut star of this group, having this great profile coming in, blowing up as a rookie, and then the team kind of indicating that he's going to play behind Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs and maybe not get the snaps. You have injuries that make it a little bit harder to answer that question. And certainly now going forward, you have the Christian Watson injury, which doesn't really put them in position to block Golden and block Reed simultaneously. You can't have an offense where you have these two really good guys and then put them on the bench for a lot of plays and run the ball, because not only then are you not using your weapons, but you're also telegraphing what plays you're going to run.
Yeah. And that's, if you're hoping that the coaching staff and the GM and everyone's aligned and this is, part of a strategic plan, you would have to imagine that the offense is going in a slightly different direction this season, because it doesn't work with a heavy run system with both those guys on. The only other thing you could look at and say is like, well, if Jayden Reed was banged up and maybe that impacted the offense from what they could do, strategically, and having a secondary option who could do some of the similar things is beneficial, but then you don't really take that at number 23 in the draft. So I think that we're going to see the team move in that different direction and go more pass heavy, and Jordan Love becomes the key piece of this offense rather than like what we seen last year with Josh Jacobs. For me, that's my hope. If that is not the reason, then it just again becomes a strategically bad decision by the organization. So can we say we're going pass heavy?
Yeah.
Let's go for it. I think that this is
kind of a fun spot for Golden if you're going to stipulate that he's going to be drafted in this range.
Yeah. And I think that, when we look at some of these decisions, are like team building, but when you're in the range of the 20s and you're making this pick, I think you have to have a bigger plan than, like, it's like we're talking about Travis Hunter. The Jaguars need to have a bigger plan than just like, we'll play him with some snaps on both sides of the ball after what they gave up. They have to be like, this is the definitive reason we're doing this. So last year, hopefully, will be the outlier in terms of how they ran the offense through the running back. But we will see. The other thing I mentioned it being, not drafting a running back that's going to come in and crush Marshawn Lloyd. I also think that if the team, like, I don't think they think that they're just going to go with Josh Jacobs for the entire season again. So again, maybe that's a hint at it. But if it's not, it's going to be devastating for all the offensive pieces here outside of Josh Jacobs. Before we finish up this one, Shawn, I have a couple of names I want to head on. Luther Burden, who I mentioned was still on the board, he goes to the Bears, divisional rival. They did take Loveland earlier in the draft. They doubled down on offense. They take Luther Burden. Interesting landing spot. Could be a really nice fit. I feel like both these players could be like really nice fits for the team's offense for a set number of plays. Not necessarily like the wide receiver 2 on the offense, but they could be like, we can run these plays that we like teams can't cover. But I think there's more upside with Burden and the Bears, but there is also more of a roadblock in terms of the players that are in front of him. And then the other players that I was going to mention was the Egbuka pick to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I feel like that's one that kind of almost puts him into, you need to be looking at least 1 year down the line. The Burden one doesn't feel like it's as far. He could be an impact player immediately for the Bears. Egbuka, though, is someone who still moved up in the rankings with the move to the Buccaneers at 19. I felt that was an overreach as well by the Buccaneers to select him there, but they're pretty crowded. How do you see those two moves impacting kind of the offenses? We have, a very positive season by McMillan to finish up the end of 2024. Then he also is in a situation where Chris Godwin gets resigned. Now they draft a rookie at 19 overall. The wide receiver room in Tampa, again, team building. If you're looking, you have 2 veterans, they're aging out. You get these 2 younger players, a second-year player and a rookie. Makes sense from that perspective, but how do we manage that for 2025?
It's tough, right? I mean, you just sort of suggested, I guess you're going in the direction of Egbuka and Burden, but teams drafting like their wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 at this range. Again, that's
what it felt like.
That's
what it felt like. Like, these are players, if this was in like late round 2 and early round 3, you'd be like, good decisions. That's where they fit in on the roster. But when you put this capital into them, you're like, needs to be more. But maybe then, being a weaker wide receiver class, maybe it's a case that they're like, well, those guys aren't going to be there at the end of that round, so we need to take them here.
Yeah, the movement kind of in that range was Egbuka going early, although in the range that we expected. You have Tootin and Scadaboo falling to day 3, but very much, again, still in the range where they could go into situations that are fine. The fallers, I think, the faller for me is Tyler Warren, where he goes as the tight end 2, but also to a team that's just not going to be able to throw the ball effectively. And if you have good receivers, which they do, you have a very poor passing game, you have very low volume. That is a disaster. We talked on the previous show that was a strong possibility for a tight end landing there. So we knew that was potentially coming, but you see him there. It's not great. I have gone back and forth with Loveland because he just goes so early and he goes to an offensive guru, but the same type of issue where the pass volume, once it's split the way it's going to be split, it doesn't really allow him to, I think, challenge those top guys. Now, one of the things that we have consistently said sort of throughout the process is don't worry about the offensive context for Trey McBride, as long as he's not behind Zach Ertz. Like once that absurd roadblock was removed, even with a Marvin Harrison, even with a Kyler Murray, he's going to flourish because he's that good. We talked about with Brock Bowers, certainly don't worry about Devontae Adams and don't worry too much about the quarterback play because he's that good. You can make a similar type of argument for Laporta, and from a big picture perspective, we've made that argument. We did encourage people to at least be a little bit conservative with him going into year 2 after already knowing that he was a star because of how complicated that situation was in Detroit. With Loveland, we have the situation that is already that complicated, and we don't know absolutely for sure that he's going to hit, and we don't know that Caleb Williams is going to be able to take the step forward. And then you have sort of an apples and oranges situation in terms of the Detroit Dome versus the Bears weather. I mentioned Loveland and kind of that context in terms of how it relates to Egbuka moving up or down, how it relates to Burden from the perspective of how do these guys interact. Because of where they went respectively, you do get the impression that the team is higher on Loveland and that he's probably a guy where any kind of competition with Kmet doesn't matter that much for him, and that Kmet probably just isn't going to be with the team for that long. With Burden, you can still say, easy wide receiver 3. You've got DJ Moore, you've got Roma Dunze, but I think it hurts them, not to the level that like Kmet is now no longer even a meaningful part of the discussion, but Burden is interesting enough once they've made the selection, right? Once they've made that pick, that it hurts them and it hurts Loveland. Actually, because there were so many concerns about Burden and what that final season indicated, to have him then go to Ben Johnson removes a lot of those concerns for me, which then that washes back on the other 3 players, and I don't like them now. And maybe you can just make the case that you don't really like any of these guys, even though you want to be invested in the Bears. This is weird, right? I mean, they make these 2 picks on offense. They don't necessarily fit with what they already had very well. They understand kind of the big picture that maybe you don't want to waste resources at running back, but in such a good running back draft, and with Damian Martinez making it to round 7, with Brashard Smith making it to round 7, they don't get their guy. And this was a weird deal where it seemed like the style of the offense required a running back pick. You mentioned at the top of the show the potential trades. Maybe they end up with just a better guy than they would have gotten as a rookie. Certainly, Travis Etienne doesn't seem that long for the Jaguars. Maybe they come out and they just have orchestrated this absolutely perfectly. But it was surprising to see them go with the positions they went with and now leave DeAndre Swift in such a strong position, at least in part, Colm, because Ben Johnson was not interested in having DeAndre Swift spearhead his Lions attack.
Yes, that's very, very true. So we will leave it there. Shawn teased Travis Etienne. We will talk potentially about the new running back down in Jacksonville on the next show, as we will dive into our favorite running back landing spots, talk through some of those names. That's where we're going to close it out. Shawn mentioned at the start of the show the RotoViz Rookie Guide. You can check that out up on rotoviz.com. Option to purchase it there, $30, but it gets you all 3 of the editions. There is also a coupon code in that for $30 off a RotoViz NFL Pass that you can use when subscribing to rotoviz.com. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on social media at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of his work up on rotoviz.com and in the RotoViz Rookie Guide. And until we are back, have a good one.